The restaurant glowed with low candlelight, casting shadows across Daniel Carter's face as his phone buzzed with a new notification. He unlocked the screen and froze. The words burned into his chest. The woman he had been waiting for admitted she was never coming. She called it a joke, a casual dismissal that cut deeper than cruelty. Around him, couples leaned close, laughter rippled softly, silverware clinked in harmony. To everyone else, it was a Thursday evening. To him, it was collapse in real time. His eyes stayed fixed on the glowing screen, breath caught somewhere between anger and grief. He had dressed carefully, pressed his old shirt, and carried hope folded into his pocket alongside 50 fragile dollars. Now, the hope crumbled. The phone's glow illuminated his humiliation, making him feel like the loneliest man in the room. A second notification landed before his pulse steadied. This time it wasn't words, but an image. His own face, tilted upward toward the restaurant door, captured by someone else's lens. The caption mocked his waiting posture. He was no longer a man with nerves on a blind date. He was a spectacle, someone's entertainment. The air grew hotter, thicker. He tucked the phone down as if to shield himself, but the damage was done. Across the room, a group chuckled into their hands. He could not be sure if it was about him, but certainty hardly mattered. His humiliation was already complete in his mind. The text was cruel enough. The photograph turned cruelty into theater. He clenched his jaw, chest tightening, wishing for invisibility. The worst part was not rejection itself. It was being seen as unworthy by strangers who had no right to judge.
When the hostess returned, her expression carried polite pressure. She reminded him softly that other reservations would soon need the table. It was meant as a courtesy, but it landed as a verdict. He nodded too quickly, an obedient reflex, while humiliation twisted like a blade. He looked at his watch, pretending she had only asked about time, then adjusted the napkin across his lap with rigid care. All around him, other guests carried on with normalcy, unaware of how fragile his mask was. He fought to appear calm, his spine locked too straight, hands pressed against the linen as if steadying a collapse. The quiet reminder was worse than scorn. It suggested his presence was already overstaying welcome. He was no longer a customer in a restaurant. He was a man loitering at a table where hope had expired. Daniel reached beneath the table, searching his old wallet as though control could be found there. The leather was worn soft, edges frayed from years of service. Inside, the folded bills looked thin, inadequate. As he adjusted them, a stray $5 note slipped from his grip and tumbled across the polished wood floor. It skidded until it stopped near the polished shoe of a stranger. Heat surged across his face. He bent to retrieve it with shaking fingers, but the simple motion carried a sting deeper than words. The restaurant's quiet luxury made his poverty louder. He had carried those $50 as a gamble of dignity. Now even that gamble exposed him. The fall of that single bill became a silent announcement that he was not only abandoned tonight, but also out of place in this room where wealth spoke in whispers.
The menu became a battlefield. His eyes scanned columns of numbers, lips moving in silent arithmetic as he measured whether $50 could stretch far enough to preserve pride. He could order carefully, disguise the limits of his pocket, and pass as ordinary. Yet every flicker of calculation made him more aware of eyes on him, imagined or real. A couple 2 tables away exchanged a glance and a faint smile, as if his struggle were visible from across the room. He folded the menu closed, pretending certainty, though his chest ached with defeat. He had mastered survival for years, stretching meals, cutting corners, improvising dignity. But survival under candlelight felt like exposure. Here, calculation itself betrayed him. The arithmetic of poverty had followed him into this room, as relentless as his own shadow. No meal could mask the mathematics of his reality. The server approached with practiced politeness, but the leather-bound folder he placed on the table might as well have been a dagger. It was meant as efficiency, perhaps, kindness, yet it told the entire room what Daniel already feared. No meal would arrive. His humiliation was now pre-packaged in a bill. He tapped the folder closed without opening it, but the gesture drew attention. Couples around him carried on, though he imagined they whispered about the man who had not even been served. His pulse beat in his ears, faster than the hum of conversation. He wondered if leaving now would spare him or brand him coward. The check's weight pressed harder than the phone's betrayal. In that slim folder lay confirmation that even the staff had accepted his abandonment before he had. He was no longer waiting. He was lingering.
His glass of water dwindled as he lifted it again and again, not for thirst, but for disguise. Each sip bought seconds of occupation, proof that he still belonged at the table. The cold liquid slid down an empty stomach that had braced itself for a shared meal. He placed the glass carefully back on the table, then lifted it again, hoping motion might mask stillness. The restaurant's rhythm pressed against him. Clinking glasses, low laughter, forks meeting porcelain. Every sound emphasized his absence of food. When the glass reached bottom, he stared at it longer than necessary, pretending choice in whether to refill. The truth ate sharper than hunger. He had nothing left to perform except presence itself. His camouflage was almost gone. Soon, there would be nothing to lift, nothing to hide behind, nothing but silence and the weight of humiliation. A burst of faint laughter carried from a nearby corner. Daniel glanced sideways and caught the unmistakable glow of a phone camera. Its lens swept across tables, pausing just long enough to frame him. He turned away, but the heat along his neck revealed he had been caught. He imagined captions already forming. A man in a pressed but dated shirt, waiting alone with nothing but water. To strangers online, he would not be Daniel Carter, father and worker, survivor of long nights. He would be content, a symbol of failure dressed up for a date that never existed. The thought stung more than hunger, heavier than loneliness. He had guarded his daughter from shame, kept their struggles private. Now, in a single unasked moment, the internet might carry his humiliation further than any cruel text ever could. He swallowed hard, powerless.
Across the room, Victoria Sterling noticed him. Her table sat in the dim glow of a corner, a glass of wine untouched, her phone silenced beneath her hand. She had witnessed boardroom battles, endured corporate betrayals, and carried reputational scars. Yet what held her gaze now was not ambition or power, it was the rigid posture of a stranger fighting to appear unbroken. She studied the tightening of his jaw, the stillness of his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked toward the door with each new arrival. He was not just a man left waiting, he was a man performing composure while humiliation stripped him raw. Something in her chest stirred, fragile and unfamiliar. She recognized desperation disguised as dignity, and she could not look away. Her hand drifted to her purse, fingertips brushing a card she had not planned to use tonight. Victoria leaned toward the passing server, her movement deliberate, yet concealed from surrounding eyes. She slid a card across the tray with soft authority, whispering an instruction. A single plate, the house favorite, and a glass of sparkling lemonade. Charge it quietly. Deliver it to the man by the window. No acknowledgement needed. The server's hesitation lasted seconds, but her gaze silenced doubt. She returned to her glass of wine, posture calm, as though nothing had passed between them. Inside, however, her pulse carried urgency she had long forgotten. She had built walls of distance in her life, ruled by logic, insulated by success. Yet here, in the glow of candlelight and humiliation, she allowed instinct to guide her. The decision was not charity, not strategy, not calculation. It was a refusal to let dignity starve unnoticed in plain sight.
The steaming plate arrived without warning, set gently before Daniel by the server. Confusion struck first, then suspicion. His hands tightened against the napkin on his lap. He whispered a protest, but the server only smiled, repeating that the bill was already settled.
For a moment, the world blurred. He scanned faces nearby, searching for ridicule, expecting cruelty disguised as kindness. The pasta's steam curled upward like a taunt. His pulse raced, unsure whether this was salvation or another trick designed for entertainment. Hunger clawed at him, yet pride resisted. He hesitated long enough for the room to notice, or so it felt. The battle inside him became unbearable. His stomach ached, his throat closed, and the single question he could not shake returned with venom. Was he truly worth a warm plate, or only worth the spectacle of refusal? As the aroma of the dish spread, a murmur drifted from a nearby table. A man whispered the word charity, soft but piercing. The sound lodged in Daniel's chest with merciless accuracy. He shifted in his seat, shoulders rigid, eyes burning against the flicker of candlelight. He had worked too many nights, fought too many private battles, to be reduced to a charity case in a room full of strangers. The humiliation was sharper than the cruel text, sharper even than the mocking photo. That word cut him down to something lesser, something pitied rather than respected. He pressed his lips together, fighting to hide the reaction, but his ears betrayed him by flushing red. The plate in front of him no longer smelled like kindness, it smelled like judgment, and judgment was a flavor he had choked on all his life.
His fork hovered above the plate, trembling with indecision. Hunger gnawed fiercely, yet pride threatened to crush him if he accepted. He imagined invisible eyes watching, waiting for him to choose sustenance over dignity. The weight of that single bite was heavier than the $50 hidden in his wallet. He clenched his jaw, forcing stillness into his hand, but the fork continued to shake. His breath came shallow, chest tight, vision dimming with the pressure of shame. To eat would mean surrendering to charity. To refuse would mean denying his body the dignity of nourishment. Either choice felt like defeat. In the silence, he realized humiliation was not always loud. Sometimes it was the tremor of a hand, the visible quake of a man deciding whether to allow himself to be seen in need. He closed his eyes. At last, Daniel lowered the fork, pierced the pasta, and raised it to his lips. The first bite filled his mouth with warmth, carrying flavors richer than he had tasted in months. But it was not food alone that struck him. It was the restoration of something nearly lost. The humiliation of waiting, the sting of rejection, the cruelty of pity, all of it softened, if only briefly, under the truth of sustenance. He chewed slowly, forcing himself to swallow pride along with nourishment. Around him, conversation continued. No one applauded, no one mocked. For the first time that night, the world felt less like an enemy. He exhaled, shoulders easing, and allowed himself to remain seated without disguise. A quiet miracle had occurred, not grand or public, but undeniable. He had accepted dignity disguised as a meal and survived humiliation's storm. When Daniel finally looked up from the emptying plate, the server discreetly slid a small card onto his table. The lettering was elegant, the name bold, the title heavy with corporate power. He blinked in disbelief, scanning the words as though they might vanish. Somewhere across the room, the woman who had paid remained half hidden, but her presence pressed against him like a quiet revelation. She had intervened without spectacle, offered without demand, and disappeared without seeking gratitude. The card rested near the candle, glowing with possibilities he could not yet imagine. He tucked it into his pocket with trembling hands, feeling as though he had been handed more than contact information. It was a reminder that even at his lowest moment, he had not been invisible. Someone had noticed, someone had acted, and that, more than the food, filled him. A week later, Daniel entered a small cafe, seeking warmth against the Boston chill. He approached the counter, counting coins from his wallet, exact change for a plain coffee.
The coins clinked onto the counter, one rolling to the edge before tumbling to the floor. He bent quickly, face flushed, retrieving it with the same trembling hands that once lifted a fork in shame. The barista smiled politely, waiting, while patrons glanced curiously. As he turned, coffee in hand, he noticed her. Victoria sat by the window, laptop open, sleeves of her blazer rolled casually. Her gaze met his, steady and unguarded. The dime he had dropped rested near her shoe. She reached it first, setting it gently on the table. His humiliation pressed in again, faint but undeniable. Yet beneath it, something steadier surfaced. She remembered him, and she was still here.
Daniel sat across from Victoria in the cafe, steam rising from his modest cup. His phone buzzed against the wooden table, again and again, vibrating with urgency. He ignored it, pressing his palm over the screen to silence the glow. Still, the vibrations persisted, rattling faintly, drawing glances from nearby tables. The viral video had found traction. He knew it without looking. His waiting face, his trembling hand, his empty glass, captured, shared, and mocked for entertainment. Victoria's gaze flicked toward the phone but returned to him without comment. His chest tightened, humiliation mounting, but he held steady, refusing to let strangers online dictate his posture here. The buzzing finally stilled. For once, silence was his choice, not a punishment. In the cafe's warm light, he found a fragile balance between shame and defiance, seated across from someone who chose not to look away. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself the ease of small talk. He and Victoria exchanged remarks about Boston's unpredictable weather, the bitter winds that cut through streets like knives, and the odd sweetness of oat milk and coffee. The conversation circled around trivialities, but within those circles was freedom. No interrogation, no judgment, no pity disguised as curiosity. Just words shared without weight. His body softened, shoulders easing from the rigidity they had carried for too long. Every sentence reminded him of what normalcy could feel like, stripped of humiliation and survival. The cafe hummed with background chatter, mugs clinking gently, light spilling in golden warmth across their table. For a brief window of time, Daniel was not the man abandoned in a restaurant. He was not the subject of a viral clip. He was simply present, unburdened, human again. Days later, Daniel found himself seated at the back of a conference room, a flyer crumpled in his hand from a cafe corkboard. The workshop on childhood nutrition felt far removed from his life, yet something urged him to stay. As slides clicked forward, he listened, absorbing terms about preservatives and allergens. When the speaker asked for questions, silence filled the room. His hand rose before his fear could stop it. He asked about single parents with no time, no money, no luxury of fresh meals every night. His voice carried steady, though his chest burned. For a moment, the room froze, eyes shifting toward him. The speaker hesitated, then responded thoughtfully. Respect flickered, but Daniel felt exposed. It was not simply a question, it was his life laid bare in front of strangers. Humiliation and dignity braided together in every word. From the front row, a young man in a pressed suit smirked and raised his hand. He dismissed Daniel's question as anecdotal, too narrow to be relevant. The words carried superiority, sharp as knives disguised in courtesy. Daniel felt the old heat rise, the same heat from the restaurant, the cafe, the countless unseen humiliations of survival. His face flushed, breath caught, but he held the silence. Daniel's next words interrupted the sting. It was not anecdotal, it was essential. The room shifted, murmurs softening, and eyes turned with new regard. Daniel sat frozen, uncertain whether he had been validated or further exposed. The dismissal still burned, but the counterpoint offered a sliver of redemption. Humiliation had not left, it lingered like a shadow. Yet for once it did not swallow him whole. He had asked, and the question remained standing. At the edge of the conference hall, Grant Whitaker leaned against the wall, phone raised discreetly. His lens caught Daniel's thrift-creased shirt, his hesitant posture, his earnest question. The clip was brief, but sufficient.
Grant smirked as he pressed save, tucking away ammunition for later. He knew the optics. A single father, out of place, dabbling in matters beyond his class. The boardroom would find it useful. Daniel, unaware, collected his worn notebook, still shaken from the public scrutiny. To him, the workshop had been a test of dignity. To Grant, it was leverage. Once again, humiliation had been extracted, packaged, and preserved for others to use. Daniel walked out into the cold air, thinking he had survived another small battle. He did not yet know that the war for his dignity was being recorded, frame by frame, by men who profited from shame. The speaker, Dr. Nathan Pierce, lingered after the session, shaking hands with attendees. He approached Daniel briefly, remarking on the sharpness of his observation about mislabeled ingredients. His tone carried sincerity, not pity, and his nod acknowledged lived experience as expertise. For a fleeting moment, Daniel felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Respected. It was fragile, almost unbelievable, yet it pressed warmth against the cold edges of humiliation. He left the building quietly, avoiding clusters of professionals exchanging business cards. He had none to offer. He had only his child waiting at the library nearby. Still, in the quiet of the street, he carried the rare weight of acknowledgement. Respect did not erase shame, but it dulled its edge. Tonight, dignity walked beside him, even if humiliation still trailed close behind, waiting for its next strike.
At the library, Daniel found Emma cross-legged on the carpet, coloring. She bounded into his arms, her tiny frame clinging to his shoulders with unguarded joy. When Victoria entered moments later, Emma studied her curiously before tugging at the hem of her coat. The child's words, simple and guileless, carried the force of thunder. She smelled like mommy. The air stilled. Daniel's breath caught, chest tightening. His late wife's memory pressed against the moment, raw and unprepared. Strangers glanced over, shushing his unsteady exhale as though grief were too loud for a public space. He held Emma close, eyes burning, ashamed of his vulnerability in front of Victoria. Humiliation and grief felt different, sharper, because it exposed not failure but longing. The child had meant no harm, yet her words stripped him bare, reopening wounds that pride could never shield. The librarian's gentle shush carried the weight of judgment, sharper than rebuke. Daniel had not spoken loudly. It was the tremor in his chest, the sound of suppressed grief that had drawn attention. He lowered his head, pressing Emma tighter against him, but the humiliation lingered. To be silenced in mourning, hushed like a child in need of discipline, turned vulnerability into shame. Victoria's gaze rested on him with softness, but even kindness felt unbearable under fluorescent lights and whispered reprimands. He gathered Emma's coloring books quickly, fumbling with pages, desperate to regain composure. The library returned to quiet, but the silence inside him was different. It was not peace. It was humiliation disguised as order. He carried his daughter out into the cold evening, his steps heavy with grief, knowing the moment would echo far longer than the librarian's whispered hush.
Later, at home, the scent of soup simmered weakly in the small kitchen. Emma lay curled on the couch under a blanket, her forehead warm with fever. Victoria knelt beside her, placing a lavender-soaked cloth across the child's brow. Then, softly, she began to hum. The melody was familiar, too familiar. It was the lullaby his late wife once sang. The sound cracked him open. His hand, clutching a ladle, trembled until it slipped, clattering loudly against the stove. The metallic clang echoed through the room, louder than grief should ever be. He covered his face, shoulders shaking, ashamed not only of the tears, but of the collapse itself. To break down in front of his daughter felt like failure. To break down in front of Victoria felt like exposure. Humiliation arrived even here, in the intimacy of his own kitchen. Days later, a plain envelope arrived, smudged from the postman's hands. Inside, a scholarship offer unfolded, promising a year-long training program in Oregon. Pride surged briefly, but collapsed under fear. The opportunity meant separation. His fingers trembled as he refolded the letter, slipping it into his pocket. For 3 days, he carried it everywhere, edges softening with touch, corners damp from his palms. Each time he looked at Victoria, each time Emma reached for her hand, the letter pressed harder against him, like a secret he dared not reveal. The humiliation lay not in opportunity, but in inadequacy. He feared asking for help with recommendations, feared looking ungrateful, feared being seen as someone who used kindness for advancement. Pride and shame waged war inside him, and both whispered the same cruel reminder: even victories could taste like failure.
The scholarship required a letter of support from a community leader. Daniel had no choice but to ask Victoria. He approached her office, its walls of glass revealing her world of power. Staff milled outside, their eyes drawn to him immediately. His thrift shirt and hesitant posture stood out against the sleek corridors. He knocked lightly, entered, and stood before her desk, words tangled in his throat. Outside, eyes lingered through the transparent walls. The humiliation was sharper than any boardroom rejection. To seek help was to admit dependence, to expose need in front of witnesses who judged silently. He handed over the paperwork with trembling fingers, his chest tightening under the collective gaze. He wanted to disappear, yet stood his ground. Humiliation had turned his request into spectacle. And still, he asked. Pride shattered, dignity tested, survival carried forward. On submission day, Daniel rushed into the community center, Emma tugging at his hand. The printer sputtered, jammed, crumpling the edges of the form he had prepared so carefully. He smoothed the paper desperately, sweat lining his brow, but the corners remained wrinkled, smeared with ink. The woman at the desk accepted it with a neutral nod, sliding it into the stack with pristine documents from others. He watched his folded, scarred page vanish among them, feeling humiliation burn through him. It was a symbol too perfect, his effort always arriving crumpled, never polished, never pristine enough to pass as belonging. He left with Emma in tow, forcing a smile for her sake, but inside humiliation carved deeper. Even success, even opportunity, seemed to demand proof he could not provide. His dreams were submitted, but their edges already bore the mark of shame. At home, Emma began a project of hope. She cut strips of colored paper, looping them into a chain, each link representing a week until his return. She counted aloud, her small hands working diligently, her eyes glowing with certainty. Daniel helped her tape the loops, though each link felt like a weight tethering him to absence. Humiliation whispered at the edges of pride. Other fathers gave their children toys, vacations, certainty. He gave his daughter a paper chain to count the weeks of his departure. The ritual was both cruel and beautiful. Emma giggled as the chain grew longer, her joy masking the ache in his chest. He watched her string the final loop, her little fingers clumsy yet determined. Hearts, she told him, did not care about distance. Her words soothed him, yet the paper links clinked with humiliation. A year later, Daniel returned to Boston with a certification badge clipped to his new coat. The rooftop launch of Sterling Organics glowed with string lights, tables of fruit cups and pastel boxes. Victoria stood at the podium, her voice carrying across the crowd. Then the AV screens flickered, glitching, and the viral video of Daniel waiting alone appeared. The meme detonated publicly. Investors whispered, mocking words drifting, $50 dates, free dinners. Grant Whitaker stepped forward, branding Daniel a reputational risk. Humiliation surged one final time, but Daniel stood steady, correcting a critical error in the product labeling that saved the launch. Respect shifted instantly. Later, Victoria approached him privately, slipping open a velvet box. She asked not to save him, only to stay. That night, they returned to the same restaurant. This time, Marco welcomed him warmly. And dignity stayed.